I gripped the steering wheel and exhaled as I pulled into my driveway, the comforting rumble of my truck's engine vibrating beneath me. Another exhausting day at the construction site, another evening where all I wanted was a hot shower and a cold beer. The truck, coated in a fine layer of dust from the job, idled for a moment before I killed the engine. Just as I reached for the door handle, a sharp rapping on the window made me freeze. My pulse jumped. I turned to see a face I'd grown far too familiar with, Karen. Arms folded, lips pursed in that signature look of disapproval, she stood just outside my truck, tapping a manicured nail against the glass. I sighed, rolling the window down halfway. "Evening, Karen." "Jake," she said crisply, her eyes flicking over my truck like it was a rusted-out junker instead of the reliable workhorse it was. "We need to talk." I already knew this wasn't going to be good. Karen never stopped by for small talk, only complaints. And since I hadn't done anything to warrant a noise complaint or a violation of her unspoken neighborhood dress code, I braced myself for whatever nonsense she had ready. She gestured at my truck. "This thing is an eyesore." I stared at her for a beat, processing the sheer audacity. "My truck." "Yes, Jake, your truck," she snapped as if speaking to a particularly slow-witted child. "I spoke with the HOA and they agree, it's bringing down the aesthetic of the neighborhood." I blinked. "The aesthetic?" She huffed. "This is a family-friendly, well-manicured community, not some backwoods auto repair lot. Big, dirty work trucks don't belong here." I took a slow breath, gripping the steering wheel to keep from saying something that would land me on the HOA's bad side for real. "Karen, this is my driveway. My property." Her smirk widened, like she'd been waiting for that argument. "Actually," she said, pulling a folded stack of papers from her purse, "HOA regulations clearly state that all vehicles must align with community standards. That includes visual appeal. And since I was on the board when we updated these rules, I happen to know exactly what they mean." She thrust the paper at me. I didn't take it, but my eyes skimmed over the highlighted section. Sure enough, there was some vague wording about vehicles maintaining an appropriate appearance consistent with neighborhood values. What a load of bureaucratic garbage. I forced a chuckle. "You do realize that rule is so vague it could apply to anything, right? If you're saying my truck violates this, so does Mr. Thompson's old station wagon and the boat Dave parks in his driveway every summer." Her smug smile didn't waver. "Mr. Thompson's car is a classic, and Dave has special permission. You. Not so much." I stared at her, my patience fraying fast. "Karen, I need this truck for work. I'm not parking it here to spite anyone. I live here." She sighed dramatically, as if the weight of my ignorance was exhausting for her. "Look, I'm being nice about this. Just park it somewhere else, down the street maybe, where it won't be such an eyesore." "That's not happening." Her eyes darkened. "Then I guess we'll have to escalate things." Before I could argue further, she turned on her heel and strode off, leaving me gripping the papers she'd practically shoved into my hands. I watched her go, irritation prickling beneath my skin. Fine. She wanted to play HOA enforcer? I'd handle this the right way. That night, after a quick dinner, I sent an email to the HOA board. Short, professional, requesting clarification. Surely, someone with an ounce of common sense would see how ridiculous this was. The response came the next afternoon. "Dear Mr. Jacobs, thank you for reaching out regarding your concern. As stated in our guidelines, all vehicles must align with community standards to maintain the integrity of the neighborhood's appearance. While we understand your position, the board has agreed that the complaint regarding your vehicle is valid. We encourage you to find alternative parking solutions to avoid further action. Best. Neighborhood HO." I stared at the email, disbelief turning into a slow, simmering anger. Karen had won. For now. That evening, I begrudgingly parked down the street in one of the guest spots. It wasn't ideal, but at least it was technically within the rules. I walked the short distance back to my house, casting a glance toward Karen's place. There she was, standing on her porch, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, watching me with a smirk. She lifted the cup in a mocking little toast before heading inside. The next morning, I found a bright orange HOA violation slip tucked under my windshield wiper. Unauthorized vehicle parking violation number 1. A warning. Next time it would be a fine. I clenched my jaw, scanning the street. The guest spots weren't technically off-limits, but I had no doubt Karen had pushed for the HOA to apply some arbitrary enforcement just for me. I glanced toward her house. There she was again, watching from behind her curtains. I took a slow, deep breath. If she thought this was over, she had another thing coming. I wasn't just going to roll over and accept this. No, I was going to fight back. but not in the way she expected. The days that followed were an exercise in frustration. Every time I walked past my driveway, now disturbingly empty, a wave of irritation surged through me. My truck, my reliable workhorse, was exiled down the street like some unwanted piece of junk, while Karen paraded around the neighborhood like she'd just won a war. She didn't even try to hide it. Each morning, she made a point to take an extra long stroll past my house, pausing just long enough to glance at the driveway with a self-satisfied smirk. It was like she was savoring her victory, waiting for me to crack. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I spent the next few days observing. I didn't just see Karen, I saw how she operated. She was a dictator in pastel cardigans, lording over the cul-de-sac like it was her personal kingdom. She chatted with the other neighbors in overly sweet tones, tossing around phrases like community standards and property values, but I could see through it. It wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't even about the HOA. It was about control. She thrived on bending the neighborhood to her will, and now that she'd won this battle, she had no reason to stop. And she didn't. At first it was subtle. The day after I got my violation notice, another neighbor, a quiet guy named Mark who mostly kept to himself, suddenly found a letter in his mailbox about his unapproved garden decorations. A week later, Mrs. Dawson, a sweet old lady who had lived here for decades, received a notice about the color of her shutters being outside the agreed aesthetic. Karen wasn't just enforcing the rules. She was weaponizing them. And nobody had the guts to fight back. I needed to be smart about this. Going to the HOA had been a mistake. They were either afraid of her or complicit. Arguing with Karen would get me nowhere. She wanted me to lose my temper, to give her an excuse to paint me as the problem. No, if I wanted to win, I had to think like her. And then, one evening, I noticed something. Karen's car, a spotless, pearl-white luxury sedan, was parked neatly in her driveway, its front bumper barely peeking over the sidewalk. At first glance, it was nothing, an insignificant detail. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was everything. Karen had spent weeks harping on about community standards, on how every vehicle needed to fit the neighborhood's pristine image. But here she was, bending the rules herself. A plan started to form. A slow, calculated counterattack. The next morning, I woke up early, grabbed my keys and moved my truck. Not back into my driveway, that would be too easy, too predictable. No, I parked it legally, right in front of Karen's house. I made sure to angle it just right, so that the first thing she'd see when she opened her door was the imposing sight of my dusty, rugged truck parked directly in front of her pristine suburban dream. Then I waited. The reaction was almost instant. At exactly 7:45 a.m., Karen stepped onto her porch, coffee in hand, ready to begin her morning reign over the neighborhood. She took one step forward, looked up, and froze. I watched from my own porch, feigning interest in my phone as her entire body tensed. For a second she didn't move, didn't speak. Just stared at the truck as if trying to process how it had materialized in her perfect little world. Then with a sharp huff, she marched straight toward it, eyes blazing. She stopped just short of the driver's side door and scanned the street, searching for me. When she spotted me casually leaning against my railing, she wasted no time storming over. "You need to move that thing," she snapped, her voice strained with barely contained outrage. I looked up, feigning innocence. "What thing?" That asterisk," she said, jabbing a finger toward my truck. "You know what?" I blinked. "Oh, my truck? Why?" She inhaled sharply, as if forcing herself to remain composed. "Because it's parked in front of my house." I shrugged. "It's a public street, Karen?" Her eye twitched. "Yes, but..." "I checked," I continued, keeping my tone light. "It's parked perfectly legally. No hydrants, no driveways blocked. Just a vehicle parked on the side of the road. Much like everyone else's." She clenched her teeth. "It's deliberate." "Is it?" I asked, tilting my head. "Because last time I checked, the HOA had no jurisdiction over public parking. And you were the one who suggested I park my truck down the street. I took your advice." Karen's face darkened. She opened her mouth, then shut it again, clearly struggling to find a counterargument that didn't immediately contradict everything she had preached. "I'm going to the HOA, she finally spat. I smiled. "Go ahead." She did. But it didn't go the way she expected. That afternoon she returned, livid. "They said they can't do anything," she hissed as if the concept was physically painful. I nodded. "Yeah. Because, like I said, it's a public street." She glared at me for a long moment, her mind racing for a way to regain control. Then, without another word, she turned sharply on her heel and stomped back inside. For the next 3 days my truck remained in its new spot. And every day Karen grew more unhinged. She called the city. She filed complaints. She even tried to claim my truck was an abandoned vehicle, only for the responding officer to confirm that yes, it was registered, insured, and legally parked. The cracks were starting to show. She wasn't just frustrated, she was losing. And I wasn't done yet. On the 4th day Karen snapped. I knew it was coming, the warning signs had been there. The twitching eye. The way she paced her front porch, arms crossed so tightly against her chest it looked like she might fold in on herself. The fact that she no longer greeted neighbors with her usual sugary condescension but instead barked clipped, irritable responses. She had lost control of the situation, and that was something Karen simply couldn't accept. It happened just after sunset. I had just returned from work and was locking up my truck when I heard the sound of hurried footsteps behind me. I turned just in time to see Karen marching across her lawn, her face twisted with barely concealed rage. "You're moving that thing tonight," she seethed, jabbing a finger toward my truck. I sighed, already bored with the conversation. "Karen, we've been over this." "I don't care," she snapped, cutting me off. "I'm sick of looking at it. You're doing this just to spite me and I will not tolerate harassment." I folded my arms. "Karen, what exactly do you think harassment is? Because from where I'm standing, all I've done is park my truck legally. If that is harassment, then I've got a few things to report about your HOA antics." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think this is some kind of game?" I shrugged. "I think it's a lesson." Her face burned red. "Well, lesson's over, Jake. I've already called someone who will take care of this." Before I could ask what she meant, a pair of bright headlights swung onto the street. A tow truck. I watched, mildly impressed, as the driver pulled up beside my truck. Karen practically vibrated with satisfaction, already turning toward me with a triumphant smirk. "You should have just listened the first time," she purred. I had to hand it to her, she had guts. A blatant attempt to tow a legally parked vehicle? That was bold even for her. The tow truck driver hopped out, a middle-aged guy in a grease-streaked uniform. He gave me a once-over before glancing at Karen. "This the one?" "Yes," she said, her tone oozing confidence. "It's an unauthorized vehicle and a nuisance." I held up a hand before the guy could even think about hooking up my truck. "Before you do anything, I'd love to hear what law I've broken." The driver hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. She said. "Doesn't matter what she said," I cut in. "This is a public street, right? My truck is legally parked, registered, and insured. Do you really want to explain to the city why you towed a law-abiding vehicle?" "That did it." The guy frowned, shooting Karen a wary look. "Lady, you got a permit for this tow?" Karen's confidence wavered. "Excuse me?" "A permit," the guy repeated, less patient this time. "HOA's got rules, sure, but I don't tow unless there's a legal order. If this ain't on private property, I need proper authorization." Karen's jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. "You don't understand, he's weaponizing a loophole. He's making a mockery of our community." The driver let out a tired sigh. "Yeah, well, loopholes ain't my problem. If it's legal, I ain't touching it." I almost felt bad for the guy. Almost. He was clearly just here to make a few bucks, and now he was stuck in the middle of Karen's personal vendetta. Karen, on the other hand, was livid. She spun toward me, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "You think this is funny?" I tilted my head. "I think it's interesting." That was the last straw. With a guttural growl of frustration, she stormed back toward her house, her heels clicking furiously against the pavement. I exchanged a look with the tow truck driver. He just shook his head. "Man, she's got a screw loose. Tell me about it." With that, he climbed back into his truck and pulled away, leaving me alone with the sweet, sweet silence of Karen's defeat. But I wasn't done. Karen had played dirty. Now it was my turn. The next morning, before heading to work, I made a quick call to the city's parking enforcement division. I kept it professional, polite, just a concerned citizen reporting a possible violation. That afternoon, when I returned home, a glorious sight awaited me. A bright yellow parking ticket sat neatly tucked under the windshield wiper of Karen's pristine luxury sedan. I took my time pulling into my usual spot, making sure she had plenty of time to notice. Sure enough, within minutes, her front door burst open. She stomped onto her porch, saw the ticket, and let out a strangled noise of rage. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. She wasn't the only one who could play this game. Karen's fury was nearly tangible, radiating off her in waves as she stood on her porch, gripping the parking ticket like it personally offended her existence. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the sheer rage of a woman who had never truly lost a battle. She had spent years lording over this neighborhood, pulling strings, bending rules, and forcing compliance through sheer persistence. And now she had tasted her first real defeat. It wasn't just the ticket. It was what it represented. It meant she wasn't untouchable. I didn't move from my spot as she stormed across her lawn, zeroing in on me with laser-focused hatred. She barely even glanced at my truck anymore. No, I was the problem now. "You think you're clever?" she spat, shoving the ticket toward me as if I had personally written it. I leaned against my truck, folding my arms. "I think the city has pretty clear parking regulations. You should really brush up on them, Karen." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Don't act like this is about parking. You're trying to humiliate me." I arched a brow. "Humiliate you? Karen, you started this. You thought you could control what happens on my property, on public property. And when I refused to roll over, you tried to have my truck towed illegally. Let's be honest here, you weren't expecting anyone to push back, were you?" Her face flushed, but she recovered quickly, straightening her spine. "You don't belong here." There it was. The heart of it. It was never about my truck. It was never about HOA rules or property values. It was about control. About who she believed had a right to exist in her perfectly curated world. I smiled, slow and deliberate. "That's not your call to make." For a second I thought she might actually scream. Her hands curled into fists, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. But then, as if realizing that this particular battle was already lost, she turned sharply on her heel and marched back toward her house, her shoulders tight with barely restrained fury. I had won this round, but I knew better than to think she was done. Karen wasn't the kind of person who simply accepted a loss. She was the type to regroup, to scheme, to find some new angle from which to strike. And sure enough, the next morning, I woke up to find an email from the HOA waiting in my inbox. A formal complaint had been lodged against me. According to the letter, I was being accused of creating a hostile living environment. Karen had painted herself as a victim, claiming harassment, emotional distress, and an ongoing campaign of intimidation. I actually laughed as I read it. The sheer audacity. But then an idea struck me. Karen wanted a war? Fine. I'd give her one. I spent the next few days gathering evidence. Screenshots of Karen's petty emails, videos of her gloating about getting my truck removed, witness statements from neighbors who had been on the receiving end of her ridiculous HOA nitpicking. And then, I did the one thing Karen never expected. I went public. I drafted a detailed, factual post exposing Karen's antics and posted it on the neighborhood forum. I kept it professional, no personal attacks, no unnecessary jabs, just a clear timeline of events supported by hard evidence. And people noticed. It started with a few likes, a handful of supportive comments. Then the floodgates opened. Turns out, I wasn't the only one Karen had targeted. Neighbors started sharing their own stories, how she had harassed them over minor infractions, how she had bullied elderly residents into unnecessary renovations, how she had manipulated the HOA into enforcing rules selectively. By the end of the day, the thread had exploded. And then came the best part. A member of the HOA board, a woman named Linda, reached out to me privately. She had seen the post. She knew Karen was a problem, but until now nobody had dared to challenge her in a way that stuck. "We've been looking for a reason to remove her from the board," Linda admitted. "But she's always been careful. Until now." She asked if I would be willing to formally present my case at the next HOA meeting. I didn't even hesitate. The meeting was held in the community center, a normally dull affair that suddenly had record-breaking attendance. Karen sat at the front of the room, her face frozen in a polite but tight-lipped smile, as if she wasn't internally seething. I kept my presentation concise, professional. I laid out the facts, played the recordings, showed the messages. And by the time I was done, the room was dead silent. Then the questions started. But not for me. For Karen. She tried to defend herself at first, tried to twist things in her favor, but the evidence was overwhelming. Neighbors she had tormented for years finally had a voice, and they used it. By the end of the night, the vote was cast. Karen was officially removed from the HOA board. She left the meeting without a word, her face pale, her composure cracking. And the next morning when I stepped outside, I noticed something miraculous. Her car was gone. Her house was quiet. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like ours again. I parked my truck back in my driveway. And nobody said a damn thing.